Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last episode, we talked about the rise of populism and the power of the little guy. Today, we're going to return to one part of that story and how railroads affected the West. The railroads aren't the little guys. They're the biggest businesses in the country. But today, we take up their story in episode 4 of Railroads in the West. So, dear student, incline your ear and hear our story so that you may find your place among his delights. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to, number 10, identify the role of the railroads in unifying the country. 11, list positive and negative effects of railroads on the nation's economy. And also summarize the reasons for and the outcomes of the demand for railroad reform. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 10. Railroads made local transit possible and westward expansion possible for both businesses and people. Railroads provided networks within the cities, but also between cities, and it made commerce move between them, but also people. And realizing that railroads would be the future of settling the West, the government made huge land grants and loans to railroad companies to go make it possible to build an infrastructure for the western part of the country. But linking various parts of the country by rail also meant that communities had to have other things in common as well. And in particular, where I want to talk about today is the question of time. Each town and each community had its own time, basically, more or less noting that each town's noon was when the sun was directly overhead. But noon in Boston, for example, was almost 12 minutes later than noon in New York. And travelers riding from Maine to California might reset their watches 20 times along the way. And railroads needed a standardized time to coordinate travel across long distances. It also creates safety on the tracks. If trains are moving with different clocks on them, you get the possibility of train accidents, but also to organize the departure times of various stations. If a train is supposed to leave at a certain time, but the train, conductor is working at a different time than everybody in the town is, that makes train travel pretty tricky. So in 1869, to remedy this problem, Professor C.F. Dowd proposed that the entire surface of the Earth be divided into 24 zones, one for each hour of the day. Under his plan, the United States would contain 4 zones with it: the Eastern, the Central, the Mountain, and the Pacific time zones. Railroad companies loved this idea, and they endorsed Dowd's plan enthusiastically. And when the railroads basically take this idea of railroad time and bring it to cities, towns said, well, I don't see a reason that we need to maintain 2 different times. And so they followed suit. And finally, on November 18th of 1883, railroad crews in towns across the country synchronized their watches to make a unified time system. In 1884, an international conference set worldwide time zones that incorporated railroad time to the rest of the globe. The United States Congress, however, didn't officially adopt railroad time as the standard of the nation until after World War I in 1918. But railroads, in effect, were uniting the country, both in physical space, but also in time. Roman numeral number 11. By linking previously isolated cities and towns and settlements, the railroads promoted trade and promoted interdependence as people were united together on that network of the earth. And as a part of that nationwide network of suppliers and markets, individual towns began to specialize in certain products. Chicago became known for its stockyards and Minneapolis for its grain industries. These cities prospered by selling large quantities of their products to the entire country. New towns and communities grew up along railroad lines. Cities as diverse as Abilene, Kansas, and Flagstaff, Arizona, Denver, Colorado, and Seattle, Washington, they owned their entire prosperity, if not their very existence, to the railroads that went through their towns. And at step point B, I want to introduce you to George Pullman. In 1880, George Pullman built a factory for manufacturing sleeper cars and other railroad cars, and he built this factory out on the Illinois prairie. George Pullman is credited for creating the sleeper car, the rolling hotel room, that if people are traveling cross-country, they don't just have to sleep in their upright seats, that you could rent a bed in a small cabin. And Pullman is credited for the invention of this idea. And the nearby town that was to support this factory that he had built in 1880, that Pullman built for his employees, it followed in part the models of earlier industrial experiments in Europe. In Europe, they had often had company towns where an industry was created and then a company would build housing and lodging for its employees and then all kind of the other parts of a town around it. Whereas New England textile manufacturers had typically provided housing for their workers, the town of Pullman was different. That Pullman provided almost everything the worker would need. Pullman residents lived in clean, well-constructed brick houses or apartment buildings. They all had at least a window in them in every room. This would have been a luxury for city dwellers that there's clean, modern structures with windows on them. I mean, this is pre-air conditioning America, right? In addition, the town offered services and facilities like doctor's offices and shops and an athletic field. Pullman would have been a pretty sweet, brand new town. But the residents of Pullman remained firmly under company control. Residents weren't allowed to loiter on their steps and hang out in public or to drink alcohol, and Pullman hoped that his tightly controlled environment would ensure a stable workforce. However, this kind of came off the rails a little bit. Came off the rails, that's an odd term for a railroad question, but Pullman had an economic setback and he had to cut workers' wages, but when he did that, he didn't cut the rents of the places they were staying. And by 1894, the Pullman strike rocked the town of Pullman, Illinois, as it led a violent strike against the Pullman Company. Roman numeral number 12. Farmers were especially affected by corruption in the railroad, and there was a fair amount of railroad corruption. They were upset by misuse of government land grants, which sold the railroads to other businesses rather than settlers. So the railroads had received land handouts from the government to go build their lines, and then the railroad was free to go sell that land that they got to other people to go finance future railroad construction or just profits for the owners or whatever. But they got government land grants, and then the railroads sold to businesses rather than to settlers, and the hope was they would sell it to settlers so that you could have more access to farmers farming out on the West. The railroads also entered into these formal agreements to go fix prices. So like the price of shipping wouldn't be set by supply and demand and competition. All the farmers were in cahoots, or all the railroads were in cahoots together to fix prices artificially high, and that had the result of keeping farmers in debt. In addition, the railroads would charge different customers different rates, demanding more for short hauls, even though they don't have to carry it as far, but there's no alternative carrier in a short haul, and so they raise their prices higher for short hauls than they did for long hauls, even carrying it over a longer distance. The Grangers began saying all of these things, even if they're legal and maybe even ethical, they all end up screwing farmers. So the Grangers began demanding government control over the railroads. And that brings us to subpoint B, the Granger laws. In response to these issues, the Grangers took political action. They sponsored candidates at the state level and at the local level. They elected legislators, and they successfully got laws passed through the state legislatures to go protect their interest. Take, for instance, the 1871 Illinois Commission that was authorized to establish maximum freight and passenger rates and to prohibit discrimination, where the government becomes like starts setting prices for the railroad, setting a maximum rate on this. Today, this actually doesn't sound very striking to Americans. We kind of understand that the government might go and set price restrictions on important things like regulating medicines or something like that. I'm old enough to remember when the government regulated airplane travel and how much a ticket might cost on flying on an airplane. But this was breaking ground in 1871, that the government was putting its control over independent business, over free business. But Grangers throughout the West and the Midwest and the Southeast, they convinced state legislatures to go pass similar laws in other states. They became known as the Granger laws. The railroads fought back, and no surprise here, the railroads are big businesses and they're going to protect their interests, and they challenged the constitutionality of the regulations. They said, is it really the job of the government to go regulate business, or should businesses be able to operate with natural supply and demand and go see what the market will allow? But the United States Supreme Court upheld those Granger laws, particularly in the Supreme Court case of Munn v. Illinois of 1877, where states won the right to regulate the railroads for the benefits of the farmers and consumers. They basically said if it benefits the people, then the government can go issue their regulations. The Grangers helped establish an important principle, and this is really why we talk about Granger laws today. The federal government had the right to regulate private industry for the public good. That question of government involvement for the public good, even in the private sphere, is still with us today, and it's carried out in a lot of different ways for good and for evil. But let's focus in on subpoint C, the Interstate Commerce Act. The Granger's triumph was pretty short-lived. In 1886, just less than a decade later, the Supreme Court ruled that a state could not set regulations on interstate commerce. So the legislature in Illinois can't set prices if the train goes from Illinois to Iowa. As soon as it crosses into another state, that's interstate commerce, and Illinois doesn't get to set that rate anymore. And the railroad traffic that either came from or was going to another state was outside of the purview of what the state legislatures could regulate. That set off a certain amount of public outrage, particularly in rural states that had fought so hard for the Granger laws, and so Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887. The Interstate Commerce Act reestablished the right of the federal government to supervise railroad activities, and it established a 5-member Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, specifically for that purpose. The ICC was a bold idea, and we don't actually see it carried out all that well, at least in the early days. They had difficulty regulating railroad rates. It was a long legal process and got resistance from the railroads who would protest for their rights to be able to set rates. The final blow to the Interstate Commerce Commission came in 1897 when the Supreme Court ruled that the ICC couldn't set maximum rates that was outside of what the scope of the government could do. But in 1906, and we're seeing a little bit into the future here, but in 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt gave the ICC the power it needed to go be effective, and then Roosevelt used it as this big trust-busting campaign that we'll talk more about in a future unit. Subpoint D, although the Interstate Commerce Commission presented fairly few problems for the railroads, corporate abuses and mismanagement and overbuilding and competition, it pushed a lot of railroads to the brink of bankruptcy. Their financial problems is what kicked off the financial panic of 1893 that we talked about in a previous episode. And by mid-1894, a quarter of the nation's railroads were owned by financial companies. They were no longer like independent railroads. They had gotten bailed out and bought by bigger companies. For instance, J.P. Morgan and Company, who had bought up the shares of so many railroads that these large investment firms were reorganizing how railroads operated. By the turn of the century, at the crest of the 20th century, 7 powerful companies held control over 2/3 of all of the nation's railroad tax. That question of consolidation and power, and does the government have the power, does the little guy have the power, does small business, does big business have the power, it will be the story of most of the first semester of American history, and is still a story in American history today. I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.